Hello and welcome to Mission in a Pandemic live question and answer. You're also very welcome. We're currently being live streamed and recorded. To comment, you'll need to log into Facebook or YouTube and give StreamYard permission. StreamYard's the bit of tech that's streaming this live stream. If you're watching this retrospectively, you can still leave us comments, but they won't be read out or responded to. If you are on social media, please do use the hashtag Mission in a Pandemic. So welcome. Church Army has a vision that everyone everywhere may encounter God's love and be empowered to transform their communities through faith shared in word and action. We seek to help realise this vision through our social action projects, such as the Amber Project in Cardiff, which works with 14 to 25-year-olds who experience self-harm, and the Marylebone Project in London, providing approximately 40,000 bed nights each year to London's homeless women. We do it through our centres of mission across Ireland and the British Isles, and whose work we'll be particularly focusing on this evening. We do it through training, commissioning and deploying evangelists. And we do it through resources for the wider church in its mission, such as Envoy, which is a coaching community that seeks to develop its members in evangelism and effectiveness in living missionally, or our Faith Empowered resource, which helps dioceses to train local lay leaders in evangelism. In all of this work, we seek to discern how God is active in mission and to understand how the church may more effectively join in. You'll see from my label on your screen that my name is Tim and I'm part of Church Army's leadership team. And it's a privilege for me to oversee the work of our research unit. This team lead the critical work of our discernment. It involves partnership with dioceses, trusts and national church bodies across these isles to develop insights to support the church's engagement in God's mission. Now, I'm always happy to have conversations with anybody about commissioning us to undertake research for you, but this evening is about a particular project. And I'm delighted that we're joined by Andy, our research team leader, and Elspeth, one of our researchers, to talk about what Church Army has got up to during the pandemic. Before we get into the meat of tonight's questions, so that we can get to know Andy and Elspeth a little bit more, I've got a couple of questions for them. Andy, if you could research anything, what would it be?
I think for me, it would have to be something to do with running, which is one of my favourite spare time activities. So if I could wangle some kind of way of doing a research project, maybe on the spirituality of running, which involved lots of participant activity on my part, I'd be a very happy man.
Thank you, Andy. And Elspeth?
So I struggled with this because one of the things I really enjoy is data. I love like big spreadsheets of numbers and sort of geeking out to that, which doesn't interest a lot of people. So I put that answer to a side. And the other thought I had was something that's been happening within the office is an unofficial research project of people sharing their favourites takeaways they've discovered during all the lockdowns and things, which has led to lots of people exploring different new options.
Fantastic. I think I'm leaning a little bit more towards Elspeth than I am to Andy. But, Andy, besides running, let's talk about something else. You've been leading the team to produce this great report, Mission in a Pandemic. Why has Church Army decided to do this research?
I think in a nutshell, we did this specific research because we were really keen to both understand how the pandemic was impacting Church Army evangelists and centres of mission, and also to unpack the different ways in which they were responding to the pandemic and serving the needs of their local communities. We did this research about a year into the pandemic, And it kind of built very much on something that we'd done in the early days of the first lockdown. In the just maybe a month or so into the first lockdown, we'd done some very quick initial research of the whole Church Army community, which culminated in a report called Mission Under Lockdown, which looked at all the different ways that people across Church Army were responding to the challenges of lockdown. And then as lockdown and the pandemic kind of went on, perhaps longer than many of us imagined it might have done in the early days, we were keen to sort of a year in kind of revisit and dig a little bit deeper, focusing more specifically on the experiences of our sense of mission during the pandemic.
Fantastic. So you've talked, or you've said the words centres of mission. I've referred to centres of mission already. Before we move on, can you unpack for us, or for the uninitiated, what a centre of mission is and how they relate to the other work of Church Army that I kind of did a quick kind of bullet point list run through?
Sure. Centres of mission are really just one of the ways through which we in Church Army try to live out that vision that you talked about earlier, that kind of grand vision of enabling everyone everywhere to encounter God's love and being empowered to transform their communities through faith shared in word and action. And, you know, across the whole of British Isles and Ireland, Church Army have got sort of hundreds of absolutely fantastic evangelists who are kind of involved in sharing faith in words and action in lots of different ways. And our centres of mission, of which we've got, I believe 31 at present across England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, are areas where we make a particularly sort of concerted, concentrated effort to focus our sharing faith in words and action within a particular place. Every centre of mission is different because we always try and respond to the needs of different communities and localities, but those 31 centres of mission are typically based in areas of quite high deprivation. They're set up very much in partnership with the local Anglican diocese. They involve a small team of Church Army evangelists and other volunteers, both working together to respond to local community needs, to share God's love, and to try and be a catalyst to help to enable other churches to grow in mission and evangelism.
Thank you, Andy. It's great to see this report in the context of the wider work that Church Army undertakes, and it's as you mentioned, there have been other contexts where we've been listening to the wider community, and indeed that wider community have continued to, as you say, to share faith in word and action, and to work with us to produce some really powerful and important resources during the pandemic. Just to highlight just one might be Death, Grief and Hope, which is a resource that's been developed and ended up in prisons with youth. It's been an adult resource that's all about that, and that's part of our pattern of listening to the wider community and to reflect back and produce resources that will be a service to the wider church. But tonight is all about centres of mission and this report that details what they've been about. As you'll have been seeing on the screen, the report, which can be found on the website, it talks about how, in view of the very considerable flux and uncertainty of the last 18 months and the different restrictions and levels of lockdown and the unprecedented nature of the past year or so, the research unit were keen to research the experiences in a relational and conversational way. I'm quoting that from the report, to research in a relational and conversational way. And I'm intrigued. Elspeth, perhaps could you share with us, what does relational and conversational research look like?
Yeah, it might look quite different to how you imagine research to look. In some projects we work on, we we may design a form that has tick boxes or, space to fill in numbers and things like that. And in this context, it really didn't feel appropriate to do that. If you think back to the very first lockdown, there was a huge amount of uncertainty and unknown of what was going on. All of our centres of mission were having to sort of adapt and change very quickly to meet the needs of their communities. And so in a very simple sense, for us as researchers, we didn't actually know what our centres of mission were doing. So we couldn't design questions to say, tell us, X, Y, and Z, because we didn't know what they were doing. So initially we were like, how can we design questions for this? We don't know. As another aspect, as I mentioned, all their centres of mission were rapidly having to deal with issues. They probably didn't have time to sit down and fill in detailed forms that we put together for them. So what we proposed was, as we mentioned, relational and conversational research. So a group of researchers, not just me and Andy, there was a whole team of us, worked with centres of mission. We set up interview or conversation times with them that took about an hour, at least an hour. And we just said, basically, we've got some guide questions we can use, but just tell us your story. Tell us what's been happening with you, what challenges you're facing, how you're approaching things. And so that was the mission under lockdown research we did for the first lockdown. So when we came to this mission in a pandemic research, which looked at the last year, we took the same approach really of actually say, we would like to have a conversation with you. It can be a guided conversation, but just tell us what has been happening in the last year for you. And yes, we covered lots of topics. So afterwards, the researchers did all the hard work. We, where appropriate, made it fit into boxes and all that kind of stuff. But we didn't want to put the emphasis on the centre of mission teams having to do that work. We just wanted them to tell us their stories.
Fantastic. And did you do this online, over the phone, in person?
I think majority of them were online, so Zoom or Teams, a few phone calls maybe.
Yeah.
But yes, sadly, we were all still working at home and things like that.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think most have experienced this as a very kind of positive way of conducting the research, and really appreciative of what's been going on, in the front line in terms of the delivery of ministry, and meeting where people are at and their capacities. Huge thanks to the team in terms of all the effort, in terms of all the calls and doing the analysis at your end, and some of the heavy lifting. So we've ended up with a report. The report, it has three main sections. The first about the impact of the pandemic, the next one about how the centres of mission responded, and the third about some wider reflections on the past year. So I wonder, can we start and work through those three sections, and so start with the impact of the pandemic, and ask simply, Andy, what did we hear about the impact?
I think we heard lots of different things about the impact, but perhaps if I can just draw out two key dimensions of the impact of the pandemic. The first is actually the very personal impact that the pandemic actually had on our evangelists and the centres of mission. Because I guess when the pandemic and when the first national lockdown hit, it was a huge, massive shock for our evangelists, as it was for us all. And I think there's a particular sense for our evangelists, because so much of their work is relational. So much of their normal day-to-day work is face-to-face. they had to kind of massively rethink, almost like nearly overnight, pretty much everything they did and the way that they did it. At the same time, as often a lot of the times, you know, those evangelists who have children or families having to kind of juggle childcare and other commitments, some with health conditions or other caring responsibilities. So at the same time as having to personally respond to all the change and transition and shock that the lockdown had, of having to adapt and to reconfigure just the way that their ministry happened. I remember talking to one of our evangelists who used the phrase shell-shocked. He described how for the first few days and weeks, he just found himself just very shell-shocked by the experience of everything. But over time, him and others, and I think this comes across in the experiences of all our centres of mission, the way that they were able to adapt and reconfigure their work and be extremely flexible in evolving and changing and responding, not just in terms of the initial lockdown, but particularly over that whole of the first year. We were living through changing restrictions and changing government guidance. So continuity for any of our centre of mission activities was really hard, because they'd go from doing things online to maybe over the summer being able to open up and do a little bit more face-to-face, and then back online and keeping in touch with different people in different ways. So just that sheer adaptability and change was one of the major kind of impacts of the pandemic. I think the second dimension that I'd really highlight is the impact on the pandemic on the communities that centres of mission are based in. As I said earlier, the majority of our centres of mission are based in areas of really high deprivation. And I think one of the things which our research shows, and I think a lot of wider research seems to suggest, is actually the impact on the pandemic on areas of high deprivation. There was a sense of it kind of very much hitting the poorest areas the hardest. So whether that's manifesting itself in food insecurity and people's the experiences there, whether it's issues of digital poverty and the kind of barriers and access that many of the people in more deprived communities face, just kind of accessing digital technology, whether it's in terms of the kind of mental health challenges of living through an international pandemic at the same time as juggling and experiencing day-to-day poverty. A real sense that a lot of the communities that we work in were hit really, really hard.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, powerful stuff, and I think the next stage of our conversation is around the centres of mission response to these things, and I know that we'll see shortly actually how they've done a fantastic job in responding. The centres of mission response is addressed in the report under three headings: the social impact, the faith impact, and resourcing and enabling others. So let's start with social impact, and perhaps with Elspeth, and then Andy. Do you have Elspeth, you mentioned you like spreadsheets. These spreadsheets, and do you have one particular number, not a whole spreadsheet, just one particular number, Elspeth, and perhaps a story that goes with it that you found to be of particular interest through the research?
Yeah, mine is around food provision. So the number for you to think on is our centres of mission were involved in delivering at least 23,800 food parcels. It's probably a much higher figure than that, but that's what we were able to estimate. And that was in loads of different sort of contexts and avenues, really. So that might be a school holiday food programme, providing hot meals to those who normally would receive free school meals. That might be working with a food bank. That might be food redistribution, so surplus from supermarkets and things like that. we'd seen a little bit of this work before the pandemic. So our centres of mission were involved in this a little bit, but it has seen a massive increase in the way the centres of mission are responding to their communities since the pandemic. So just one example would be Dundee Centre of Mission. I remember talking to them. So they did run a food bank before the pandemic, and it was fairly small. It just provided for people in their local community. They're in Downfield in Dundee. And once the pandemic hit, the council actually approached them and said, would you be one of our food providers for the city? So there were a number of providers, but they were one of them. And so suddenly they had to massively expand their food bank provision. Whereas before they were just meeting the needs of people they knew in their community, suddenly they were actually going much wider across the city. They've actually said for them, reflecting on this, because they're still doing this now, it's meant that the awareness of the Centre of Mission has increased massively in the city. They're delivering to people they weren't in contact with before, but also actually people who are looking to support food banks and initiatives like it are aware of them now as well that weren't before.
Thanks, Elspeth. That's great. And it's great to see that response. And it's great to get our first question from Andy. And I think it is a great question, and which is, and I'll read it. Does it depend upon how you define deprivation? And this goes back to our Andy in the note that you described the most deprived communities, and so Andy Wilson's asking, does it depend on how you define deprivation? People who live in those areas would not see themselves or their communities as deprived. And I think we have probably a technical and probably can discuss a little bit more of an answer to that question if you're happy to. And Andy, who I can see on screen, to answer initially, if you're happy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the language of deprivation is often the language of people who analyse statistics and who allocate resources, and have often it's often quite a crude or quite a blunt way of being able to somehow measure or report on the differences between poorer and more affluent areas. And I think those kind of statistics and scales certainly have some value in terms of differentiating between kind of poorer and affluent areas, and somehow signalling something about the broad characteristics of the areas that many of our centres of mission are worked in. But I think Andy's point is a really, really good one, and the issues around use of language when we use with relation to talking about the communities we work in, and actually a commitment to working with the way that local people describe those areas, their areas. So rather than exclusively focusing on the problems or the challenges, is of actually recognising, and I think all our centres of mission do this really well, of recognising the assets and the strengths and the positive qualities of those communities. And it's not about being blind or ignorant to the challenges of them. There's something about facing the challenges, but there's actually recognising the strengths and the values of those communities as well. So yeah, really, really helpful question and comment from Andy.
Yeah, absolutely, and a really helpful answer, Andy. And I think the sort of thing that we could discuss at length. And so I'm not going to be tempted. But if people do want to put more into the comments, we're really happy to continue that line of questioning. But for now, I was going to ask Andy about his number and story in relation to the social impact aspect of the report.
Absolutely. So my one of my favourite numbers was the number 3,100, which is our estimate for the number of people who received kind of emotional or mental health related support through our different centres of mission. And again, because all our centres of mission are very different, the way that it actually happened varied massively from centre of mission to centre of mission. But to just give you one example, one of the centres of mission that I kind of personally interviewed and spoke to was Bradford Centre of Mission, which does a lot of work through the Sorted Youth Project, working with young people. And Sorted's got a very large community of young people and younger adults who they support and are in relationship with. And during the pandemic, they kind of instituted a sort of a system of what they called welfare calls, which is finding the right ways of ensuring that each young person or young adult from the Sorted community had meaningful contact from a Sorted youth worker or another member of the Sorted youth team. So whether that was regular phone calls, whether that was regular text messages, or appropriately kind of monitored sort of social media or kind of private messaging, they instituted quite a regular system for ensuring on a regular basis each kind of young person who wanted to be kept in touch with was contacted and received support, both practical and emotional. Alongside that, as and when restrictions allowed, they did what they called Garden Gate detached youth work, which is as well as getting in touch with people via messages, arranging to sort of pop round and to see young people at appropriate social distances to really check in with relation to how they were doing amidst the challenges of school closures and withdrawal of other support services. And I know that speaking to Tracy Milne, who's the lead evangelist there, alongside that kind of general keeping in touch with each young person and young adult through Sorted, the team also got involved in a number of pieces of, I guess, things what might be termed sort of crisis support, when particularly young people were really, really struggling or in dark and low places. Lots of the team sort of going really above and beyond to spend time with and to help that young person go through the particular challenges they were facing, and drawing in other agencies and professionals when that was appropriate as well. So that was a real highlight and standout thing for me.
Fantastic, and I can understand why that is. That's it's a great number, and it's a great story. Of course, we can find out more stories online about our other centres of mission. So that was social impact. The report then moves on to talk about faith impact. So did we see development in this area of work, and similarly perhaps share a number and a story? If we start with Elspeth.
Yeah, I'm going to be slightly cheeky and share two numbers and stories. But the first number is 19,700, which is a big number again. So centres of mission had to take different approaches to engaging with people, because in very few circumstances could you actually physically meet someone during the lockdowns. So they made great use of social media, perhaps much more than they had before. And a number of centres of mission created short videos that were kind of online devotionals or reflections. They just posted on Facebook, YouTube, wherever, and just allowed people to engage in different ways. There were lots of different things. There were some that did sort of thought for the day, daily prayer type things. Others did them for specific situations. So maybe nerves around returning to school and things like that. A couple of examples I've got for you. Langley Centre of Mission, which was it launched during the pandemic. They put up a banner in the high street that just sort of slightly mysteriously said Happy Valentine's Day, and had a QR code which took you to a video all about Valentine's Day and John 3:16, so sharing about love and God's love for us. Another example, which I absolutely loved, was Haverfordwest Centre of Mission in Wales. They use their Instagram stories to effectively sort of live document the days leading up to Easter, which I've never seen anyone do something like that before. They so posting as if they were there, witnessing Jesus arriving in Jerusalem, the Last Supper, the events of Good Friday, but the amount of dedication they showed, even in the middle of the night, getting up, posting, I've just seen Jesus being taken before the judges, what's going to happen? And so actually it was a real way to actually experience the emotion of what that must have been like for someone experiencing it. So that, I love that, just a really different creative way of engaging with people. Another creative thing was Centres of Mission created something we called creative evangelism objects. So 5,300 physical objects were created. And so this is things like knitted angels. Several Centres of Mission have whole teams of people who knit or crochet little tiny angels for them that they then leave on people's doorsteps or actually just around the streets of their area, that have little tags on them that just say Merry Christmas or a link to a website. I know North Belfast Centre of Mission handed out, I think it was 600 packets of seeds, because they have a gardening project, again, with just a little message on it to share with people. Centres of Mission also did some really creative, just like chalk art and messages on streets, again, that anyone could come across. So just thinking of different ways to engage and encounter with people when you can't physically meet them. Yeah.
Thanks, Elspeth. It's so inspiring to hear of the creativity of our evangelists in our Centres of Mission. I'm so proud of the work that they've undertaken, and thank you for capturing that for us and sharing just then. How about you, Andy? Are you going to transport us?
Yes. I've got a number for you as well, which is a smaller number than some of the other numbers we've talked about, but I think it's a really important one. The number is 27, because we know that at least 27 people became Christians through our Centres of Mission over the last year. And I'd really stress that at least, because we think that number is quite a significant underestimate. The reason for saying that is, as part of the research we designed, we explicitly didn't go out to ask all our evangelists or Centres of Mission, how many people have become Christians through your work over the past year. That wasn't the primary focus of what we wanted to find out. But in sharing their stories with us, a number of evangelists and Centres of Mission told us that delightfully, some people had become Christians over the past year. And when we kind of added up the stories that we were told, that number kind of came to 27. As I say, we think that there's probably plenty more, but that's the number that we know about to date. Just by way of just a couple of examples, one of the stories I love is one which Kerry Dixon, who leads our Dundee Centre of Mission, which Elspeth has already mentioned, told us. And that was a story about someone who had previously been a drug dealer, but kind of got involved with the Centre of Mission and originally started volunteering with them and getting to know them through volunteering in the Centre of Mission activities, and subsequently over a period of time went on to give his life to Christ. And then Cherif, from our Liverpool Centre of Mission, told us what I think is a really important story about someone who Cherif and others had been kind of working with and getting to know over quite a long period of time, a period of about 2 years. But at one point over the past year, in the context of a sort of community Bible study, this person decided that she'd reached a stage where she was ready to kind of make a commitment of faith for herself. And I think that's a really important story because it illustrates that a lot of our work takes time. We're not really about flash in the pan, quick results necessarily. Our work, the work of centres of mission is very relational at heart. And there's something about going with the pace that people are at and journeying with them. And it's delightful that in time we see these signs of stuff bearing fruit in people's faith journeys.
Thanks, Sandy. I think 27 is quite possibly my favourite number of the night. It's a great number. The third theme that's discussed in the report, as mentioned, is this thing called resourcing and enabling others. I suspect we've titled that in the report because it's part of Church Army's DARE strategy that's doing, advocating, resourcing and enabling evangelism. It's something that all of our centres of mission are involved in. So what has kind of resourcing and enabling others looked like, and has anything been striking for either of you? Perhaps Andy first this time.
Yeah, I'll kick off on that one. I think my overall observation is that all our centres of mission continued to be involved in advocating, resourcing and enabling evangelism. But during the pandemic, the way that they did that had to significantly change or evolve. So it's that kind of point of that adaptability and flexibility. Quite a few evangelists told us that some of the ways that they'd been doing that before, things like courses or groups to help churches grow in mission and evangelism, needed to stop or to pause during the pandemic, though some were able to move online. But during the pandemic, they were able to do quite a lot of sort of behind the scenes work to support and enable different churches in evangelism, whether that was kind of more informal conversations with other church leaders, whether that was actually using the time and space afforded by the pandemic to kind of explore new partnerships with other organizations. My overall impression is just the sense of it continued to happen, but a little bit more behind the scenes and beneath the radar than in some of the more easily measurable ways, though I equally know that Elspeth's got a great measurable stat that I think she's going to share now.
I love a great measurable stat. Wow, Elspeth.
So the first thing to say is, as well as our paid staff, a lot of centres of mission have volunteers who work with them as well, and they actually couldn't run without their volunteers. So 463 people were volunteering in our centres of mission for the last year. And when we asked about those people's experience of church and Christianity, we found that 44% of the volunteers were not regular churchgoers. Which is kind of amazing when you think about it. The other thing to note is many of the centres of mission told us that a lot of their existing, so pre-pandemic volunteers had to take a step back, that they were perhaps a bit older or had other reasons that they needed to shield, and so they weren't able to be involved with the work anymore. But almost immediately they found that a whole sort of new set of people were coming forward, and these were mostly people who were on furlough and looking for things to do effectively and wanting to help in their communities. So our centres of mission sort of attracted this whole new set of volunteers, really, which is actually something that's been seen in quite a lot of the voluntary sector over the last year, which is, again, this kind of unexpected thing that's happened, that this situation has led to centres of mission making contact with a whole new set of people that, as they have come off furlough, returned to work, may still want to be connected in some way. But as I said, 44% of these volunteers were not regular churchgoers. So the way we view that is our centres of mission, in sharing faith, it's not just to the people who are being served, if you want to use that term. It's also actually the people who are working alongside as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Elspeth, and it's very powerful that, particularly off the back of Andy's story about Dundee, that volunteers are on a journey with us. So thank you both for sharing about some highlights from those parts of the report. The report, as I've mentioned, differentiates or kind of reports separately between social impact and faith impact. In your experiences of talking with evangelists, how clear is that distinction? Go on, Elspeth.
It's not at all clear, and I think that's brilliant. So one of Church Army's sort of mottos or sort of taglines is faith shared in words and action. And so for a lot of our centres of mission, those things go very much hand in hand. There were lots of times when we spoke to the evangelist, and initially we did have categories, and we were saying, okay, so this thing you're telling us about, is it a social activity? Is it a faith activity? And they were like, it's both. And actually, yeah, I can completely see that. So just as an example, we keep going on about Dundee, but Dundee again, they have a group called Pirate Monks, which is for men who are sort of recovering from addiction and other challenges. So as a social aspect of that, it plays a really important role of helping those people on their journey of recovery. So there's practical help and support, and the social aspect of that of being a community together. But it is also a Christian community. They pray together, they study the Bible together. Both those things very much go hand in hand. Another example is several of the food banks we spoke to said, well, yes, we're providing this practical need, we're providing food to people, but also as a social aspect, for some people, this is the only time they see another face in the week. And then it taking place in a church or a recognizable Christian building often led to people opening up and maybe sharing about what they're experiencing and asking for prayer and things. So there is very rarely a clear distinction.
Thanks, Elspeth. I still can remember a wonderful visit up to Dundee, and Andy was with me, and we spent some time with the Pirate Monks and worshipped with them, and what a wonderful evening. A really great bunch of people. But I'm going to come back to Andy now, and unless anybody wants to ask a question and push a little bit further in terms of the social faith relationship. But if we're waiting for a question in relation to that or a follow up, for now, one of the reasons we conducted this research is to record a moment in history in Church Army's life. It's also part of our ongoing discernment. So having listened and reflected and written this report now, is there a kind of, so what should we now do in response to this research, Andy?
Yeah, as I was reflecting on this, I think there's sort of two real standouts. So what's for me? The first is about simply getting behind our centres of mission and other Church Army evangelists we know, because I think it's probably really important to stress that although we've kind of focused particularly on the experiences of centres of mission, I think in many ways the stuff that we see happening in centres of mission mirrors the kind of work kind of happening up and down the country through the work of kind of Church Army evangelists all over the place. But yeah, every time I do one of these interviews for projects like this with a centre of mission or a Church Army evangelist, I I genuinely find myself kind of quite humbled and moved, and it's one of the real privileges of my job to have these sort of conversations and to hear some of these stories which we've been sharing firsthand. So I think the sort of first so what is simply, if you know a Church Army evangelist, encourage them, affirm them, express thanks to them. If you're able to pray for them, maybe donate, just find ways, and the ways which are right for you, of getting behind them and encouraging them and affirming them in their work. So that's my kind of real first so what. The other is actually, I was thinking earlier today about perhaps what can we all, and those of us who might not be evangelists, kind of learn from the experiences of these centres of mission. And as I was thinking about that, I was reading back over the foreword that Peter, our chief executive, wrote kind of at the start of the report. If you go to the start of the report, you'll be able to read what Peter says. And when Peter's describing the experiences of our centres of mission and our evangelists, he says three things about them. He says that they prayed hard, they loved deeply, and they had a go. And it struck me that those three things, praying hard, loving deeply, and having a go, in spite of all the challenges that knock us for six, is something that maybe we can all engage with.
Thank you. That's great, Andy. Really powerful. Andy Wilson, bless him again. It's got another question for us, as well as the initial impact as such. Is there any noticing in relation to the ongoing journeying with people? Elspeth or Andy?
I think one of the things which is quite helpful for us in terms of the kind of ongoing research that we do is, in terms of our research team, this wasn't just a piece of one-off research. We're in periodic contact with each of the kind of evangelists in centres of mission. So whether it's every 6 months or every year, it varies depending on the thing. But normally it's the same researcher who gets in contact with the centre of mission and same evangelist each time. So for example, I mentioned Tracy in Bradford Centre of Mission earlier. I spoke to her when we did this initial research back in it was back in May earlier this year. But again, then I was able to be in touch because we were doing some other research, and literally just earlier this week, I was able to pick up the phone to Tracy and actually say what's been going on and be able to hear some of the encouragement and stories of the Centre of Mission. So I'm not quite sure how well that answers or gets to the heart of Andy's question, but I think we're able to pick up something of that kind of ongoing impact and hearing some of the ups and downs of the story. Yeah, that was my start for 10.
Thank you, Andy. I think it's a great starter for 10, and it leads into a little bit. Andy, I can't even go Andy W because you're both Andy W. Andy Wilson, has there been any research on the impact upon the evangelists themselves through their work, expectations of others, and so on? Which probably leads me into a question that I was going to ask Andy Wier in relation to the ongoing work of the research unit. So I think a kind of short answer into ongoing research, the impact of the impact on the evangelists themselves. The research unit are actively engaged in a range of projects, and we have our own kind of in-house work, that Elspeth leads on in, which is called Recording the Journey, which seeks to follow evangelists over time in the centres of mission to try and understand how that ministry is impactful. I think there's other work that might touch on the impact upon the evangelist of the pandemic, and things like stress and pressure in work and ministry that we really want to be paying attention to. But Andy, I just wonder whether or not you could briefly tell us a little bit in terms of the kind of the what next, and maybe in that context you might want to touch on the pioneer research that you're working on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really, really timely, that that kind of question from Andy. We've got lots of exciting kind of research projects on the go within Church Army's research unit at the moment, and a couple which are kind of nearing completion and are likely to be sort of publicised and promoted a little bit more in the new year. One of those kind of projects is a piece of research on what's called kind of distance church, which is kind of exploring people's kind of experiences of church during the pandemic, and really looking forward to that coming out. But I think one of the ones that might be particularly relevant to the point that Andy makes is where in the new year we'll be producing a report on the experiences of paid pioneers, because as well as our internal research for Church Army, over the past couple of years, our research unit have been doing a number of different evaluations and pieces of research on pioneering initiatives within other dioceses and other denominations. So we're building up a sort of national picture of some of the recurring themes that we're noticing across people who are employed in paid pioneer roles. And one of the issues that we're noticing is around the joys and frustrations of people in pioneering roles, the challenges and the weight that they often carry with relation to the expectations that are placed on them, sometimes associated with the effects of funding and other things. So within that new piece of research that we'll be launching in the new year, we'll be kind of trying to provide a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we in Church Army Research Unit kind of observe within the wider national pioneering landscape, drawing on the experience of our research with evangelists, but also with pioneers in other initiatives around the country. So watch this space.
Thank you, Andy. And I think that really helpful summary kind of touches also on a comment that Jane Henderson's made about evangelists being able to take time to rest and recharge in a season where it looks like they haven't stopped. I think we'll be speaking to some extent into that space in that report in the new year. So thank you, Andy. I'm going to be bringing us into land now by saying a big thank you to Andy and Elspeth for sharing with us, for the team that you work with, Andy and Elspeth, for all the work that they've done. But I suppose just echoing Andy's reflections in terms of the kind of the so what, and about getting behind our evangelists, just an encouragement to do that. And there are various ways in which we can do that that Andy shared with us. If you know no one, we can say thank you to them. We can pray for them. And if you're in a position to do so, we can support them financially. We're just a couple of clicks away from our donation page. And if you don't know many of our Church Army evangelists, Cuppa with a Key Worker is a great way to hear about the work that's going on in the centres of mission. It's when we interview someone in a centre of mission, or one of our evangelists who isn't in a centre of mission, and find out what they're about and hear their stories firsthand. Our next Cuppa of the Key Worker is on the 8th of December. It's the final one of the year, so don't miss out. If you want to connect with Church Army community, in the next live stream will be our community service on Wednesday, and then our Advent service on the 1st of December at 7 p.m. So wherever you are, whenever you're listening, every good blessing, and have a fabulous evening, day, morning, wherever you are. Bless you all. Goodbye.